Earthworms can be a great indicator of the health of your garden soil. No earthworms? Your soil's probably pretty poor. Join me today as I discuss earthworms and how to attract them to your garden. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and when we discuss earthworms, it's important to understand that not all earthworms are the same. There are three basic types of earthworms. There are epigeic earthworms, endogeic earthworms, and anisic earthworms. The three different types of earthworms play different roles in our garden soil. They live and work at different levels in the soil. Some live at ground level and others live in the basement. The epigeic worms are the ones that live at the soil surface. These are the ones we use as composting earthworms because they're not burrowing into the ground. They're living underneath leaf litter, maybe at the edges of your compost pile. And in the case of a red wiggler, they might be living in the bin in your basement, eating your food scraps. The endogeic worms live in the soil, but not deeply in the soil. They're typically in the 5-inch to 10-inch range below the soil surface. They're making horizontal burrows as they're eating the organic matter that's in the soil. When you dig in your garden beds, typically it's these kind of worms that you find in your soil. The anisic earthworms are the big boys. These are the deep burrowers. They can burrow as deeply as 6 feet in the ground. Those big earthworms that you might see coming up and creating mounds that you love to catch and take fishing, that's the deep burrowing worm. They are taking the organic matter from the top of the soil, mixing it deep down into the earth. The three different types of earthworms are all doing basically the same thing. They're eating decaying organic matter. And in the process, they're also eating bacteria and fungi and other soil microbes that go in the front and come out the back. It's a lot like a chicken. They actually have a gizzard that grinds up all of the food that they're consuming. And then when they poop it out the back as worm castings, that material tends to be pretty high in nutrients. It has nitrogen, it has phosphorus, it has magnesium and calcium. And by doing that, the earthworms are helping to add nutrients to our soil. Earthworms are amazing animals. They're incredible at building good soil. The nutrients are just one of the things they can do. Now, I want those nutrients. That's why I'm trying to attract earthworms to my garden, because I've had my soil tested and it's very poor, very low in the nutrients that the earthworms can bring. But my soil is also very compacted. It's dense. We've had a couple days of rain and I can't even push a finger more than about 1/8 of an inch into the soil. The earthworms are great at decompacting the soil. With their horizontal burrows and their vertical burrows, they're loosening the soil and they're bringing oxygen into the soil along with water as it goes into those burrows, and that helps increase the soil life, those microbes that are necessary to grow good plants. Earthworms can improve the structure of both clay soil and sandy soil. Now, in clay soil, the particles are very, very small. Air can't get in, water can't drain out, and that's why we don't like to garden in clay. But through a process called aggregation, as the earthworms are burrowing, the mucus from those worms and the secretion out their gut helps to bind those soil particles. And those soil particles are bound with some of that organic matter. So in clay soil, instead of lots of little tiny particles, you have these aggregates that begin to develop. And those bigger aggregates within that clay soil help with the drainage. It helps improve the structure. In sandy soil, it's the opposite. We have so much pore space, so much space between the larger particles that the water drains right through. Along come the earthworms with those same aggregates that now help fill up some of that pore space and absorb and hold onto the moisture in the soil. To attract earthworms to your garden, it's all about that organic matter. You need to have food for the worms below the surface and above the surface. In this whole area, the soil is the same as I have in the other parts of my landscape. What I've done here is cover this whole space with a thick layer of wood chip mulch. And by having this wood chip mulch and keeping the soil moist, I'm encouraging all those earthworms that I'm hoping to find. The soil is already loose enough that I can work my fingers into it. And if I dig down, hopefully I'll find some of those earthworms. Like this earthworm right here. By just digging in a random spot, I've uncovered a worm that's having a happy time in my soil. So the worms have found this space. Now, this is an empty space with no plants growing in it, and I still found a worm. I can expect that at the roots of my plants and trees, I will find many more worms growing. The soil life around plant roots is astounding, and that's why you'll find earthworms around your plants. It's like a smorgasbord of their food as they go through your vegetable garden beds. And this was the first bed I found worms in early spring, before I put any of my crops here. But that's because I left some of my plant roots in the ground over the winter. My bigger plants, like my tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers, when it's time to clean up in fall, I'll just cut off the stalk, the main stem of the plant, and leave the roots in the soil. Because that's a great place for the worms to find food, particularly in early spring. My soil freezes in winter, so those burrowing worms are going to burrow as deep as they can to stay warm, and they're going to curl up into little balls. I've dug up in early spring some of those tight little balls of the earthworms that are just waiting for the soil to warm up. That's a process called diapause. That's earthworm hibernation. And it's a good idea not to dig in your soil in winter when the ground is frozen. You can end up killing a lot of hibernating worms. Wait until the soil has thawed and has warmed up before you dig in your spring soil. And even then, you may still find some of those worms that are waiting for the soil to get warmer. Generally, the worms like soil that is between freezing and about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, but that varies by species. So the epigeic worms, the ones that are living at the very top underneath the leaves and eating everything within just a couple inches of the surface, they operate best between 55 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets colder than that or hotter than that, they're not going to do well. And as with vermicomposting, when you have worms inside to eat your kitchen scraps, that's the range of temperatures you should shoot for. So when you bring those composting worms out to your garden and the weather changes and begins to get too cold, they're not going to be eating, and they're going to end up dying off because they can't handle severe cold temperatures of winter. A great way to not only attract the worms, but to give them the ideal living conditions is by using mulch. In this area, around my fruit trees and fruit bushes, I have about 5 to 6 inches of wood chip mulch. And every time I add a plant, I find earthworms in the soil. I consider this my earthworm superhighway. Any worms that might have been on the periphery, maybe in my neighbor's yard, were able to travel to the rest of my garden underneath this bark mulch, protected from the harsh conditions of the sun and moving in moist soil, because this deep mulch helps keep the soil moist and it helps moderate the temperature so those earthworms are nice and happy. There are other ways to keep your earthworms happy and to keep them thriving. When you have a good earthworm population, try not to disturb the soil too much. Avoid tilling if you can. It's a myth that when you cut an earthworm in half, it makes 2 earthworms. Instead, what it does is kill the earthworm. So, as much as possible in my beds, I'm not digging, I'm not tilling, I'm mulching and letting the earthworms be happy in the soil within. I'm also not adding synthetic chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers. That can disrupt the soil life, and when you disrupt the soil life, you're disrupting the food chain that includes those earthworms. Now, for the most part, I'm allowing the earthworms to find my garden naturally through a build it and they will come philosophy, and it works pretty well. But as I add new beds, I will do some transplanting. I'll take some of the worms that I already have and move them to other beds that aren't as high a population of earthworms. In the fall, I do amend most of my beds. I do that with a garden fork to try to keep the soil as loose as possible and to minimize cutting any earthworms in half. And as I'm amending the beds, if I find a bed that has a low population, I'll take some of those worms that have a high population and move them. But I'm only doing that with my own native worms. I don't think it's a good idea to buy worms and bring them in, because they might not match your climate, your weather patterns, and your soil. And there's a lot of areas of the world that have invasive worm species, like the jumping worm problems that the eastern United States is having a big problem with. So taking some worms from one part of your garden to another part of your garden can work okay, but you might not want to bring in worms from a location and a source that you're unsure of. Now, another role that earthworms play that needs to be mentioned is as a food for other animals. This is another great way to see how healthy your soil is. When that big fat red robin takes an earthworm from your soil in spring, it's telling you as a gardener that you've got earthworms in your soil, enough that the robin can find that earthworm. And if you should happen to cut a worm in half while you're digging your bed, well, go ahead and feed it to other animals. If you've got chickens, they love nothing more than to fight over an earthworm that you throw into their chicken run. If nothing else, just leave it in the soil and it will become food for a lot of those microorganisms that are within the soil. It's easy to attract worms to a garden by understanding their benefits and how they live. The organic matter is key. Mulch definitely needs to be part of the situation. And before you know it, soil that's terrible can be better, and you can have a thriving earthworm population. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.